In the last 90 days, the Nigerian National Bureau of Statistics released a figure that should have stopped the country cold. 53.4%. That is the percentage of Nigerians between the ages of 18 and 35 who are either unemployed or underemployed, the highest disaggregated youth figure the agency has ever published. There was no ministerial press conference, no presidential address, no prime-time coverage. The number appeared quietly in a PDF on a government website, and the country moved on. Meanwhile, the streets did not move on. And while every major outlet is framing what is happening right now as a social media moment, a generational hashtag, an outburst of frustration, nobody is asking the more dangerous question. Who is organizing the financial and logistical infrastructure behind a movement this coordinated? What do they want after Tinubu is gone? And if this protest succeeds in forcing political concessions or fails and gets crushed, which specific power blocks inside Nigeria's elite structure walks away stronger? Because in Nigerian politics, mass anger is never just mass anger. It is also a resource, and someone right now is harvesting it. Before we go further, if you are new here, this channel exists for one reason: to give Nigerians the political analysis mainstream media is too afraid or too compromised. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. So what exactly happened and why now? The immediate trigger is not a single event. It is a convergence, 3 simultaneous shocks arriving in the same season. The naira crossed 1,100 naira to the dollar on the parallel market. The removal of the electricity tariff subsidy added an average of 47,000 naira annually to household costs. And then a video went viral. Footage alleged to show security operatives executing unarmed civilians in Plateau State. Footage that, as of this recording, has not been officially acknowledged or denied by the presidency. Not denied, not confirmed, simply ignored. The government's response to the protests has been to frame them as the work of sponsored destabilizers, opposition proxies exploiting economic frustration for political cover. That framing is deliberate, and it serves a very specific function. It allows the government to respond with security forces instead of policy answers. Once your protesters become a security threat, you no longer have to negotiate with them. But here's what the sponsored destabilizers narrative does not explain. The August 2024 protests were largely spontaneous and fragmented. They surged and faded without institutional backbone. What is visible now is different. The geographic spread from Kano to Benin City to Port Harcourt, the legal support networks activated within 48 hours of the first arrests, the coordination across platforms that did not collapse under the first round of takedowns, that is pre-positioned infrastructure. That doesn't mean the anger is manufactured. The anger is real, but real anger and the organized exploitation of real anger can exist simultaneously. History in this country proves that. In 2012, the Occupy Nigeria protests over the fuel subsidy removal mobilized millions within days. Jonathan eventually reversed the full removal. But within 18 months, the same energy was captured, redirected, and neutralized by the same elite networks that initially feared it. The protesters did not get a new Nigeria. They got a partial subsidy restoration and a political realignment that empowered the very APC coalition that later dismantled what remained. If that pattern feels familiar, it should. Now here's the fact that reframes this entire story in a way almost no one is discussing. The CBN's Ways and Means data, the mechanism by which the federal government borrows directly from the CBN outside the National Assembly's appropriation process, shows that between January and March 2026, the federal government drew down an additional 4.2 trillion naira. And this is happening during a period of record oil revenue, which means either the revenue figures being published are not the actual figures, or money is leaving the system through channels that have not been audited. That fact has nothing directly to do with the protesters in the street, but it has everything to do with why the conditions that produced those protesters could not be prevented. Now let us go a layer deeper, because the surface story, angry youth, government crackdown, opposition positioning is not the full story. Nigeria's legal framework governing protest rights sits at a collision point between three instruments. The 1999 Constitution Section 40 guarantees freedom of assembly. The Public Order Act, inherited directly from military rule, gives state governors sweeping powers to prohibit gatherings on broadly defined security grounds. And the Cybercrime Act, as amended, has been deployed to arrest individuals simply for coordinating protest activity on social media. The ambiguity between these three instruments is not a legal accident. It gives the executive branch what lawyers call prosecutorial discretion, the ability to decide case by case which Nigerians exercising the same constitutional right get protected and which get detained. That discretion itself is a form of political power, and it is being exercised right now. Who benefits from sustained protest-driven instability? Not who claims to benefit, who actually does. The most direct institutional beneficiary is the security establishment. The Nigerian Army, the DSS, and NSCDC all receive emergency supplemental budget allocations when civil unrest is formally classified as a security threat. Between 2020 to 2023, security votes to state governors, funds with zero public accountability, increased by 340% in states that declared protest-related emergencies. There is a budget incentive structure embedded in instability that almost no analyst discusses openly. Then there is the 2027 calculation. Tinubu's path to a second term depends on two variables: delivering enough visible economic progress to suppress opposition enthusiasm and holding the ACP coalition together, especially across the Northwest and the South-South. These protests directly threaten the second variable. If the Kano street presence grows, and Kano is the single largest state voter bloc in Nigeria, the northern ACP governors, who are already in quiet negotiations over 2027 presidential zoning, now have new leverage. Every day these protests continue in the north is a day those governors can go to Abuja and demand something in return for delivering calm: appointments, contracts, infrastructure announcements. This is not speculation. This is how Nigerian federal politics has always worked. Three blocs are watching all of this very carefully. In the Southwest, Yoruba political opinion is fractured. There is visible elite discomfort with the optics of a Yoruba president presiding over a multi-ethnic youth uprising that cuts across every region. In the Southeast, Ohaneze and IPOB have released statements with notably different framings. Ohaneze cautious and measured, IPOB seeing a political opening. And in the North, the Arewa Consulting Forum has been conspicuously silent. When the ACF goes quiet during a national political crisis, it almost always means internal negotiation is active. Silence at that level is never neutral. The institutions that should be speaking are also silent. The central bank governor has made no public statement on the monetary and fiscal policy outcomes driving the protests, despite those outcomes being the explicit grievance. The Minister of Finance gave a brief televised comment. The National Economic Council, which includes all 36 state governors, has not convened an emergency session. That coordinated institutional silence means one of two things. Either they have been directed to stay quiet, or they are deliberately distancing themselves from a presidency they believe is politically weakening. Now, follow the money. The 4.2 trillion naira Ways and Means drawdown connects to a specific structure in the 2026 budget, a 1.7 trillion naira line item called the Renewed Hope Infrastructure Fund, disbursed through a special purpose vehicle set up outside the Federal Ministry of Works' normal procurement architecture. The board of the SPV has not been publicly constituted. The contracts under that fund have not appeared in the Bureau of Public Procurement's open database. That is not a procedural oversight. Special purpose vehicles are chosen precisely because they operate outside the standard accountability framework. That is the point of them. Across the contract award documents connected to this SPV, its provisional registration filing, and CBN correspondence obtained by two separate civil society organizations, one name keeps appearing:
a specific Abuja-based holding company called Renewed Capital Partners Limited. It surfaces as either a named contractor or a disclosed related party in transactions totaling over 380 billion naira. We will get to exactly what that company is, who controls it, and why it is directly connected to the people in the streets right now. But first, here is what almost nobody has connected yet, and it changes the entire picture.
These protests are not just a political crisis. They are surfacing a structural fault line in Nigerian federalism that has been widening for over 2 decades. Nigeria's revenue-sharing system has drifted across successive administrations towards a model wherein states are increasingly dependent on monthly FAC allocations from the federal center rather than on internally generated revenue. When the federal center weakens, both politically and fiscally, states do not automatically become stronger, they become more desperate. 3 state governors have already quietly requested additional federal security deployments to manage protest activity in their capitals. That request is simultaneously a security decision and a political one. It makes Abuja responsible for any violence that follows. It transfers culpability upward. On the economic consequences for ordinary Nigerians, the numbers are stark and they are official. The IMF's April 2026 Article 4 consultation projected Nigeria's real GDP growth at 3.1%, below the population growth rate of approximately 3.6%, which means per capita income is contracting in real terms, even during what the government is calling an economic recovery. Food inflation is running at 38.87% year-on-year, according to the NBS. The World Food Programme's Nigeria Country Office has reclassified 4 additional states, Zamfara, Sokoto, Borno, and parts of Kogi, as Phase 3 food insecurity zones in 2026. These conditions existed before the protests began, which is exactly why no security deployment could have prevented them. There is also a security dimension that is almost entirely absent from mainstream coverage. Every battalion redeployed to Lagos or Abuja for protest control is a battalion not operating in Zamfara, not in Borno, not in the southeast. Sustained urban protest activity stretches security forces that are already operating across active insurgency theaters, active banditry suppression operations, and active separatist tension management simultaneously. That reallocation creates operational windows for non-state actors who monitor deployment patterns closely and have historically exploited them. This is not a hypothetical. It has happened before in this country more than once. Now, Renewed Capital Partners Limited. This company was incorporated in October 2023, 5 months after the Tinubu inauguration. Its directors include 2 individuals who served on the APC's 2023 Presidential Campaign Finance Committee. It has received no bid contract awards under the Renewed Hope Infrastructure Fund for road rehabilitation across 3 states, none of which rank among the states with the highest infrastructure deficit scores on the Federal Ministry of Works' internal ranking. The work went, in other words, not where the need was greatest, but where the relationships were strongest. The protests happening in the streets of Nigeria today are the downstream consequence of an economy in which 380 billion naira of public funds flows through a company that did not exist before the current president was sworn in, awarded through a procurement structure that bypasses competitive tendering and audited by no independent body. That is not coincidence. That is the policy architecture that produces hungry, unemployed, and furious young Nigerians. The protests are the symptom. That company and what it represents about how power and money move in this republic is closer to the disease.
Now, to be rigorous, and this channel does not do one-sided analysis, what is the strongest case for the other side? The administration's most coherent argument is not that conditions are acceptable. They are not arguing that. The argument is sequencing. The fuel subsidy removal and the naira float they contend were unavoidable corrections to distortions that had compounded for a decade. The pain is real but transitional, And any reversal would return Nigeria to a system in which 10 trillion naira in annual subsidy spending was effectively a wealth transfer to a small class of oil marketers, politically connected fuel importers, and cross-border smugglers, not to the poor it was claimed to serve. That argument has genuine economic merit. The IMF, the World Bank, and most credible independent Nigerian economists agree that the pre-2023 subsidy regime was unsustainable, regressive, and captured. A government defending painful but structurally necessary reforms against populist pressure is not on its face governing badly. Here is where the argument collapses. The problem is not the reforms. The problem is what happened to the fiscal space those reforms were supposed to create. The fuel subsidy removal was projected to save the federal government between 3.5 and 5 trillion naira annually. The 2025 and 2026 budgets show no corresponding increase in social protection spending, no expansion of the National Social Investment Program, no scaling of the school feeding scheme, no increase in capital allocation to health or education as a percentage of GDP. The savings from the reforms did not go to the Nigerians who were told to absorb the pain. They went to an expanded security vote, to debt service, and in the documented case of the Renewed Hope Infrastructure Fund, to a procurement structure built around a company incorporated 5 months into this administration that has never been publicly audited. You cannot defend the pain of a reform by citing its theoretical benefits when the actual proceeds of that reform are unaccounted for. And here is the misconception that needs to be corrected, clearly, without condescension, because it matters enormously for what comes next. Many Nigerians believe that if Tinubu leaves office, whether through resignation, impeachment, or electoral defeat in 2027, economic conditions will materially improve quickly. That belief is not just incorrect, it is dangerous, not because Tinubu is irreplaceable or beyond accountability, but because the structural conditions driving this crisis, the debt architecture, the oil revenue dependency, the IGR weakness of states, and the Naira's fundamental vulnerabilities will not change with a change of face at Aso Rock. What a change of president changes is the person. What it does not automatically change is the system that selects, funds, and protects every president Nigeria has had since 1999. Understanding the difference between those two things is the difference between a protest movement that produces transformation and one that produces a new name on the same machinery. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything. So where does this go from here? The presidency will escalate the foreign sponsorship narrative over the next 2 to 3 weeks. Watch for a DSS press briefing with alleged documentary evidence of external funding. Whether that evidence is credible or fabricated, its political function is identical: to reframe the protests as a national security matter, which triggers a legal framework that supersedes civil liberty protections. The specific word to watch for in official government communication is treasonable. When that word appears in a statement, a court filing, or a presidential address, it signals that the security response has been formally authorized at the highest level and that the government has decided confrontation over concession. The northern APC governors, specifically Kano, Kaduna, and Niger states, will use the protest as leverage in closed-door Abuja meetings to accelerate the release of federal capital project funds. This is transactional politics operating exactly as it always has. They will publicly call for calm while privately using the unrest as a bargaining chip. If you see major infrastructure project announcements for those states within the next 45 days, that is not a coincidence. That is the negotiation concluding.
The organized opposition, primarily LP and PDP, faces a genuine strategic dilemma. Visibly aligning with the protests validates the sponsored destabilization narrative. Staying silent forfeits a mobilization opportunity ahead of 2027. Watch for a middle path, a formal call for a national dialogue or an emergency economic summit. That framing allows opposition politicians to associate themselves with the protesters' demands without the legal exposure of direct protest leadership. It's safe, it's cynical, and it's coming. 3 specific signals to watch in the coming weeks. First, any National Assembly motion invoking Section 305, the Constitution, a state of emergency declaration, would represent a significant escalation with direct implications for how 2027 is structured. Second, the CBN's next monetary policy communique. If it raises rates again, the damage to mortgage credit and SME financing will add a new economic flashpoint to an already volatile environment. Third, and this one matters, whether the Bureau of Public Procurement publishes any retroactive documentation on the Renewed Hope Infrastructure Fund's special purpose vehicle. If civil society pressure forces that disclosure, the political damage to the inner circle of this administration could be severe and rapid. That disclosure is what they are most afraid of, which is exactly why it hasn't happened yet. Now, the question this analysis opened with: who is actually positioned to benefit from this protest, whether it succeeds or whether it fails? The answer, based on everything traced here, is not the protesters themselves. The structural beneficiaries are the northern APC governors extracting concessions from a weakened presidency, the security establishment receiving expanded mandates and supplemental budget allocations, and if the government falls or is forced into early political negotiations, the same network of elite financiers who have funded Nigerian transition since 1999, including those connected to the procurement infrastructure around Renewed Capital Partners Limited. The young Nigerians in the streets are the moral force of this moment. Whether they become the political beneficiaries depends entirely on whether this movement develops the organizational discipline and the policy specificity to convert street presence into institutional leverage before the leverage window closes, as it has before, every time before. And if this trajectory continues, if Nigeria's political elite successfully absorb this protest the way it absorbed 2012 and 2020 and 2024, here is where Nigeria ends up in 5 years. A country that has normalized the permanent presence of youth protest as a pressure valve. Episodic, loud, internationally visible, domestically unresolved. A country where the elite has learned to manage popular anger as a recurring cost of doing business rather than a mandate for structural reform. A country that is too large to fail and too fractured to fully succeed. That is not a prediction of collapse. It's a description of managed decline. And managed decline is exactly what benefits the people who currently control Nigeria's resources. So here's the question I want you to sit with and answer in the comments below. If the protesters' core demand is that Tinubu must go, and he does go, name one specific structural change to the procurement system, the debt architecture, or the security vote framework that automatically follows. Because if you can't name it, that's the conversation Nigeria actually needs to be having. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what's really happening in Nigeria. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.